Welcome to this edition of Excavating the Bible, a program dedicated to exploring the contributions of Middle Eastern archaeology to our understanding of and appreciation for the Bible. I'm Doug Clark from La Sierra University. I direct the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology. I'm joined by two colleagues, also from La Sierra University. Larry Geraty, co-host of this program and former president of the university. You continue to work for the university. Has the university left you yet? They have not left you alone, and you have not left the university. So
it's a privilege to continue to be involved.
Actually, and we work together on a number of projects related to archaeology. And Dr. Bramlett, who is an associate professor of archaeology and the history of antiquity and chair of the Biblical Studies and Archaeology Department in the Divinity School, HMS Richards Divinity School at La Sierra. We have, again, come to one of our episodes dealing with biblical books, New Testament books this time. Books from the time of the Roman Empire. And so we keep orienting ourselves to that, and we'll do it again with these books. This time, the Catholic or the general epistles. The worldwide epistles addressed more widely than Paul to the Philippians or Paul to the Ephesians. It's rather now this global audience that seems to be intended. Although some of what we're going to be talking about seems to be directed to individuals. So we'll think about those too. So the books we're thinking about are 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, very short books, at least 2nd and 3rd, and then the book of Jude, before we get to the last book of the New Testament, the Apocalypse, or the book of Revelation. So as you've thought about this collection of books, these Catholic letters, how have you related to them? Have you found something that's particularly useful? Have you been excited about them? Or you want to go back and read Genesis, being an Old Testament scholar?
I'm always open to going back to Genesis, but since tonight we're talking about these general epistles or letters, yes, I think that each of them are of interest, and the themes that they deal with and the issues that they touch on still have relevance for today, and it's really interesting to see if these are written by the apostles, which they probably were, because that's one of the criterion for getting into the canon of the New Testament, is that you either had to be a disciple of Christ or closely related in one way or another. So it's interesting to see what exercises them and what's important to them as they communicate with people in their spheres of influence.
In this emerging expansion of Christianity. So in a sense, you get a bit of a pulse of communities in different parts of the empire, probably, at least certainly different parts of Palestine, but I would expand that too. And in the process, one gets a feel for the issues and the challenges. Letters like this often come about because there are issues and they need to be addressed. We will see with 2nd and 3rd John that the author really would rather write less and talk to them face to face. I mean, it's the same words toward the end of each of those letters. But yeah, we can get a feel for the issues that confronted these early Christian communities.
And I think that the authors, if they are Peter and John, the disciples that we know about, they're writing from centers of the empire out to more far-flung places, it looks like.
Would we have communities that would be particularly responsive to Peter? Would we have communities for whom these letters mean something more than a community that Paul was associated with, or Timothy, or whoever? Would we expect something like that? And maybe some diversity between
It seems the case. I mean, Paul refers to that as well. He had issues with Peter from time to time. And we hear the followers of Apollo, and we don't have any of his books. But certainly people probably were partial to the apostle or missionary who first converted them and established their church. And they would identify with that tradition.
Isn't it Peter that writes from Babylon? Where is that? Probably not.
No.
In Iraq, right?
Not Iraq.
But maybe
Symbolic.
it's symbolic of Rome. People have suggested that, you know.
Sure.
And if we're talking about John's letters, it's probable that he wrote from Ephesus, where he spent so much time, and we think that some of the people that he's writing to are in Asia Minor, probably. Yeah.
I don't know about Jude. I'm not so certain about.
There's not much in the book to
No,
give
there's
us
not
clues.
much
Right.
to go by. So we do have to pay attention to these.
Of course, we know Peter was executed in Rome.
That's
so
right.
That
Yeah.
would line up.
Well, and certainly when you get to the Apocalypse, to the book of Revelation, the beast and connections with Rome, they're inescapable. They are absolutely inescapable. So sure, that would be a fairly easy connection, I think, to make. So. Well, before we look at the book itself, let's think about some artifacts. It's always fun to have some artifacts in front of us. And we have a variety. And these have been provided, as always, by Christina Reed, who is our assistant curator at the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology, and a master's graduate in Near Eastern Archaeology. Our first master's graduate.
That's right.
She beat her competition, one of our Jordanian colleagues, by, I think, a week, something like that. So it was a
She
close
worked
race.
hard to be first, didn't she?
She was very anxious to do that and have some bragging rights.
And I think the artifacts that are out here on the table really very nicely give us a picture of life in the Roman Empire.
Right.
So nice collection.
Right, and would be known by anybody acquainted with this book, with these books, with these letters. Kent, what do we have on your side?
Well, just thinking about what Larry said about life in the Roman Empire, containers. You can tell a lot about a society
Isn't that true?
by the containers they use and what they put in the containers. If we were to dig in our dumps in the last century, I mean, think of the 1950s and earlier milk bottles.
Yeah.
You know, and how that changes to plastic, and maybe food takeout containers now representing a whole shift in how families spend their time together, not at the dining table.
Garbology, huh?
Yes, and so we're looking at containers from the Roman world, and wow, you know, you have this ossuary, the bone box, the valuing of the human remains, and the importance of having a family tomb where all of the family can eventually come together in final unity.
And the Jews who are in the diaspora all around the Mediterranean world, if they can afford to, they want their bones to be put in a box and buried in the Mount of Olives to be ready for the coming of the Messiah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Very expensive land there now.
Right.
Extremely.
They're starting to stack the
On top of each other, yeah.
and then other containers, of course, and we have a whole variety, but again, representative of Roman food habits, their proclivity for sauces, and
very much so.
You know, one thinks of the fattened dormice, you know, that they apparently fattened in
Dolphin
in
seems to
jars
have
and
been eaten a lot.
packed dolphin meat, sure.
Right. So. Larry, we have some lamps here. One of them interesting, especially as we're looking at some of these books.
That's right. In one of the books that we'll be talking about, it talks about angels, and here on the face of this lamp is an angel-like figure, winged, certainly, and a nice way to, a nice thing to put on a lamp.
In 1 Peter 3, 2 Peter 2, and Jude. The
All mention
same
angels.
references to angels and angelic bad behavior, which doesn't quite resonate as we think about these things, but we'll come
They're both good and bad angels, right? And these other, well, all of them are lamps from the Roman period, starting with the time of Christ, the Herodian lamps, and going into the rest of the century. Most of these things that are pictured here or on the table here have to do with grooming, largely by females. We talked about the dipper here that
For sauces.
For sauces, that's right. This is a small spoon that would probably be used in cosmetics. A couple of
you know, bracelets or bangles.
Or bangles.
And sometimes it's material-based, the way you define that.
That's true.
But
And this would have to be for a pretty thin little
small child.
small child. A mirror that's made from bronze. You can see the bronze disease is beginning to eat into it, but that's a mirror that may be almost 2,000 years old, a comb that's we find from the ancient world. Over here, more cosmetic vessels, and these probably for ointment or something like that. This one here, we were talking about earlier, is probably an inkwell that had ink in it that would be utilized in writing.
We have the author of 2nd and 3rd John saying, I'm not going to spend a lot of time with paper, by which we assume it's papyrus or parchment, paper and ink. I would rather see you face to face.
Face to face,
So
yeah.
we have a good example here of something in the Roman period for ink. And then a couple of probably hairpins. It would be smaller pins usually that would hold the toga together, the clothing, the outer clothing together. And then, of course, a necklace here of beads. These probably come from an earlier time period, but they were ubiquitous, and people kept using them over and over, and were very important, especially, I'm assuming, for the elite. I don't know how, well, maybe you could find pieces of stuff that you just picked up and drilled a hole into to make it if you were poor. But and then we moved to a horse's bit, part of a bridle. That shows up and is much more important in James, because James talks about the tongue as a small member of the body which controls large parts of the body. And so it talks about a bit. You can control a large animal with this small thing.
Okay.
It also talks about a rudder, and there actually are reliefs of Roman ships with rudders on them. And then a fine, fine bowl, probably a serving bowl of some kind. So some important artifacts that illustrate life in this time period. If we go to our slides and then we think about the geopolitics, as we always do, and I think about the context, Kent, I'm going to let you do this, and we're going to do it fairly quickly with the Roman Empire. What?
I mean, by now we're well into the Pax Romana with these epistles. And Rome controls everything from the deserts of Arabia to the Atlantic Ocean, up into Britain, and all across North Africa. These letters are general. I mean, that's the Catholic epistles, that's what that means. And were probably distributed very widely across into the new communities of Christians across the Roman Empire.
There's another Romana that I've come across in the last few days of looking at material related to this particular episode, and that is Via Romana, the way of the Romans. That's actually listed among their virtues, that you live in the way of the Romans with the sorts of things. We'll actually look at those virtues a bit later too. So if we think about the chronology, Kent, what's missing from this particular chart?
Well, we don't have the next dynasty, the Flavian dynasty as it's called, so that would be Vespasian, his son Titus, both of whom are involved with the destruction of Jerusalem. Yeah, and then Domitian, the third one, that ends that dynasty. So it's not a particularly long-lived dynasty, but it's important to this formative period.
Really is.
When the church is establishing itself.
And we think the Johannine literature, the literature tied to the Apostle John, what, all comes from the 90s, probably? Is that what we need to think about? So, and if that's true, we do need to think about Domitian. We need to, I should have extended our list here just a bit.
But that was good for most of the New Testament period. Yeah.
And when we turn our attention to the Apocalypse, to the book of Revelation, we're going to have to go farther than this chart allows to. Date of writing. Now we have 6 books, okay? 2 epistles, letters of Peter, 3 of John, and 1 of Jude. How far and wide are we thinking about here for those 6 letters?
The second half of the 1st century. How about that?
Well, that's true. You would be accurate in that. Now we do have Jude, and if it is Jude, the brother of James, and you have that in the Gospels, and you also have, I think, 3 references, then 2 references to Jude, the brother of Jesus. So this is the extended family of Joseph, as we think about it. But would this need to be that Jude? And would James actually need to be that James? I mean,
both of those names are widely
popular.
used in this time, right?
But
But
there
to
are-
get into the canon,
yes.
that makes some
And there are good
suggestions.
reasons
There are good
for
reasons,
tying them
right.
to these brothers. So we think about that. We'll look at some of the concerns, some of the major concerns and background issues. But we're going to take a minute with each of the 6 books and their outlines. So we'll try to do so quickly, but I think we get a feel for these books if we just look at the outline. First Peter, concerned with living in a time of, maybe short on hope. I mean, these letters weren't written in a vacuum. They were written to people with particular needs, and so, and people who lived in this, as in that one part of the outline, a world of unbelievers. So how do you do that? How do you survive? There's one part of this outline that we'll come to later in chapter 3 that does have to do with these angels, these angelic beings. We'll come to those. Suffering, that seems to be a common theme in these Catholic epistles.
lots of persecution in the New Testament period.
Right. And when you move to the end of the first century, a lot. And then periods of it until we finally come to Constantine, who, legalizes Christianity, makes it the official religion. So here's 2 Peter. Interestingly, a longer outline with 3 chapters than 1 Peter with 5 chapters, but
Touches on more issues.
it does seem to do that. And you will notice in chapter 2, dangers of false prophets and teachers, also talking about angels, angels that were disobedient. So we'll come to those. Catalogs of virtues and vices. We've talked about this on our program before, but it is worth stopping and pausing for just a minute to think that, yes, virtues and vices that would come from the Hebraic world, come from the Old Testament, come from Jewish thought, but they're living in a Roman world. And a lot of these virtues and a lot of these vices are similar, but it seems to me that in the Roman world, because of this Pax Romana, because of this empire, because of so much happening that was similar everywhere around the empire, that there was more at stake here. And to have the virtues like being gracious to your fellow citizens, like having the spirit of Rome, there are these personal and private virtues, and they were the glue that held society together and held the empire together. It seems to me. I don't know how you would react to that assessment of the vices and the virtues. Are they that important, do you think?
I think they are. And the Romans strongly emphasized some virtues that wouldn't overlap necessarily. You know, the high regard for, really for self-composure in the face of danger. I mean, one can appreciate that, but that was played out then in the gladiatorial games. And that's why they so much appreciated those, because they could identify with those virtues. But the virtues that you've listed are definitely very formative for Roman society, and in many ways, good government everywhere.
And as you've noted, they're both private and public virtues. They're things that you need to do as an individual, and they're things we need to do as a group of citizens.
Now, some of them are a little bit unusual. I mean, it's one of the public virtues, hilarity. You know, being happy. I mean, why not? Why shouldn't that be part of our list too? Humor is one of the personal virtues. Modesty and chastity. These epistles, these letters, are often concerned about being modest and about being chaste. So there certainly is overlap, and so the resonating, the echoing would have happened to anybody living in the Roman Empire and knowing something about these virtues. So that's a part of this context that we think about. Okay, so that is 2 Peter. Now, if we go to the Johannine, or the John epistles, this particular outline has a couple of pages to it. What words show up here that probably give us a good feel for the epistle?
When you, under A there, you're talking about light and darkness. This is something that's very important to a strand of Judaism, you know, that's connected with Qumran and the Dead Sea Scrolls. They had whole treatises on both light and darkness. So it's very interesting to compare and contrast John with Qumran.
Right. Kent, there's another word that shows up, or a couple words that show up here.
Well, I was just reflecting on the first. Even building on that, you know, it starts out anarche and halagos. In the beginning was the word, and it reflects in Genesis. And of course, the first creative act in Genesis is the creation of light. So you're pulling in all of these ideas that echo themes through the Old Testament, but put Jesus at the center.
Okay, you guys have not bit on this. Okay, so if we're looking at this, assurances, encouragement, that kind of thing, that's what I was thinking about, which suggests the need for this. I mean, why write all of this down? And in the second part, of course, you have admonitions and instructions, but assurances, that sense of encouragement that comes in this letter. 2 John, only one chapter long, only, 13 verses long. And the last verse of this and of 3 John are the same as a couple of verses before it. I don't want to write a whole lot to you. I want to talk to you face to face. Otherwise, spiritual condition, joy, and an exhortation to mutual love. And Larry, to whom is 2 John addressed?
Yeah, it's specifically addressed, it appears, to a woman who has of some esteem, a repute, you know. We don't have her name, but it's somebody in his circle of friendship, I guess, that he's writing to.
Right. 3 John, addressed, as we can see in the outline here, to a man by the name of Gaius. And so, again, prayer and health, well-being. Now, there is a complaint here. Kent, how should we say this Greek name under C?
Diotrephes?
Diotrephes. And so there's a problem. Evidently, I don't know if it's insubordination or somebody who seems to track in a different way, so pay attention. There's a warning. Be careful here. And then finally, Jude, again, one chapter, 25 verses, and a number of things tied. It feels different from like 1 John or like 2 John. This seems to be much more about some evils around and paying attention to these evils and paying attention to suffering connected with these evils, because they bring suffering upon these communities of faith. And so that's where we're going to be talking a little bit about some angels coming up. Which is coming up very soon. We'll look at a couple of things here tied to governments. It's not only here, but Paul talks about being subject to the governing authorities. And then we've got slaves and masters, but it's that third part here, in an enhanced angelology. I guess some theologian invented that, some modern theologian invented it, and connecting to the flood. And that happens in 1 Peter, 2 Peter, and in Jude. So we have to think about that. We've talked before about Greek slaves and masters, so we have that image. And here, dressed down, the slaves dressed down more. Kent, I hear you talking about dress codes, and that slaves seem to be...
It's kind of their uniform. Clothing identifies us, and for the slave, that was the minimal wear, identified them as that, possessing that role, filling that role.
Angels, okay. Lots of angels. Angels seem to increase in popularity more between the Old Testament and the New Testament than anywhere else. So that by the time we get to the New Testament, there are these echelons, these layers, these levels. It's like working through a governmental bureaucracy where there are these different angels responsible for different things. And I don't know how this connects with saints in early Christianity, and that you have a number of different kinds of saints performing different functions and so on. But in any case, we have this. And then if we think about books about angels, we have to think about these apocryphal, apocryphal or deuterocanonical. If one's Catholic, then it's deuterocanonical. or pseudepigraphic books, false writings.
And because these come between the Old and the New Testament, we know that the New Testament world knew about these, and so there are connections of reference.
There's a sense in which we read the New Testament with eyes much wider open and with enriched results and rewards if we would read that intertestamental literature.
Right.
Because people in the New Testament period knew all about it, and they keep referring back to it, especially these letters, these Catholic epistles. They refer back to them regularly. So for us to understand them and interpret them and put them in context and put these letters in context, having some awareness is a good idea. It's a great idea. So what do we have in the angels? Angels in, well, they're tied to Genesis 6 with the sons of God and the daughters of men. And okay, how we interpret those, people will always debate. But we can say how Jewish literature in the intertestamental period interpreted them. The sons of God were angelic beings. They stepped outside of their angelic role, cohabited with women, had children, the Nephilim, the giants, or the fallen ones, and then the giants in the land. And so they were evil, and they're out there. They're creating trouble. They create suffering for believers. So how do we control them? Well, Jesus in 1 Peter 3 went to visit the spirits in prison when he was crucified. This is a theology we have to ponder for just a bit. Goes to the spirits in prison, visits them. They know he's in control. And that's what believers of Peter's audience now know, that Jesus has already told them off. He says, you guys, you're headed for destruction. You are not in charge of my followers' lives. And I'll show you how. You are now capped in prison. And
so be of good courage,
so
believers.
well, that's what it's about.
Right.
That's exactly what it's about. Same thing in 2 Peter 2 and in Jude. Same kind of thing that's going on. Well, okay, Kent. Okay, I've put fake on this photo. So why did I do that? And
you know,
and why do people think about this?
These sorts of pictures are passed around the internet from time to time, and people get excited. I mean, it would be phenomenal to find a giant skeleton like this. I mean, this one is maybe extreme. The skull is just
okay.
practically as
I'll
big
go
as the
to the next
individual.
one, which seems to be more like what you see.
And you know, people want to believe that something spectacular has been found. And so far, we have dug up thousands of graves, and we haven't found giants that are of this scale. Unusually large humans like now, but not like this.
I've seen these on websites that are strongly supporting biblical authority, and how do we know that? We've found giants.
Right.
But these are all photoshopped.
Right.
So in a way, we have to think about archaeology, and then we have to think about abuses of archaeology too. So thank you, Larry. Thank you, Kent. And thank all of you for joining us for this episode of Excavating the Bible. We hope we've added something to your mind and to your soul, and we look forward to next time. Until then, keep believing and keep exploring and think ancient. For Excavating the Bible, I'm Doug Clark.